Ukraine and Russia are two countries in Europe. A few years ago, they started having a big problem. Russia wanted to control some parts of Ukraine, but Ukraine did not agree. This caused a big fight between them. In 2022, Russia sent its army into Ukraine. This made the problem bigger. Many countries around the world are worried and trying to help stop the fight. They want Ukraine and Russia to talk and solve their problems peacefully. People in Ukraine are very brave. They are trying to protect their homes and their country. Many other people from different countries are helping Ukraine by sending food, medicine, and other important things. This fight has made many people leave their homes. They go to safer places where there is no fighting. Recently, the situation in Ukraine has intensified. Russia has launched numerous missile and drone attacks across various regions in Ukraine, causing significant damage and distress among the population. These attacks are part of a continued conflict between Russia and Ukraine, affecting many innocent people and infrastructure. In response to these developments, the United States, under President Biden's administration, has taken steps to strengthen its support for Ukraine. The US has lifted restrictions allowing Ukraine to use American-supplied long-range missiles to defend itself more effectively. This move is aimed to enhancing Ukraine's military capabilities to respond to Russian attacks and to protect its sovereignty. This support from the US includes not just military aid, but also strategic and humanitarian assistance, demonstrating a strong commitment to Ukraine's cause. The decision to enable Ukraine to employ more advanced weaponry reflects an escalation in international involvement and a significant step in the global response to the conflict. These ongoing developments indicate a critical phase in the conflict, where international support and military strategies are playing pivotal roles in shaping the course of events. The hope is that these efforts will lead to a de-escalation of violence and progress toward peace. Okay, Patrick, first of all, bring us up to date on the developments of the last 24 hours.
Okay, well, Holly, a few days ago, Joe Biden was at the G8 summit in Rio or someplace in Brazil, and he announced that he had given permission for Ukraine to use these long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia. And they only work with U.S. permission because only the U.S. has the satellite codes to be able to dial into the targets. Russia responded by updating their nuclear doctrine, and Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, yesterday announced that they were going to be using these American missiles to strike into Russia. It's a type of missile that's harder to shoot down. And then this morning, they did this. Ukraine launched missiles into Russia, and Russia responded by even further updating their nuclear doctrine, and they say that now, because of the way the conflict is, according to their updated nuclear doctrine, they can strike Europe with nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean they're going to, but they can. And a lot of it has to do with these treaty agreements and with NATO. And the area that Ukraine has struck inside Russia is actually an area that they now control. A couple months ago, Ukraine actually went into Russia and grabbed part of the province. And this isn't even the disputed province that has been in this civil war, but actually a part that is universally recognized as Russia. And they've been looting, they've been going into the supermarkets and just grabbing everything. They've been kidnapping people. And now there are 10,000 North Korean troops inside that province of Russia. this. A lot of developments in the last 24 hours.
Quoting an American scholar, John Meiersheimer, on inscription of the conventional wisdom as to the causes of the conflict, it is widely and firmly believed in the West that Putin is solely responsible for causing the Ukraine crisis and certainly the ongoing war. He's said to have imperial ambitions, which is to say he's bent to conquering Ukraine and other countries as well, for all the purposes of creating a greater Russia that bears at least some resemblance to the former Soviet Union. In other words, Ukraine is Putin's first target, but not his last. As one scholar put it recently, he's acting on a sinister, a long-held belief to erase Ukraine from the map of the world, giving Putin's purported goals. It makes perfect sense for Finland and Sweden to join NATO and for the alliance to increase its force levels in Eastern Europe. After all, Imperial Russia must be contained. So, Patrick, has Meiersheimer articulated well the conventional wisdom?
Yeah, he has actually. But then he went on in the talk to say that while this narrative is repeated over and over again in the Western media and by virtually every Western leader, there's no evidence to support it. Look, Kholy, Putin has said, and I'm quoting Putin now, Russia cannot feel safe, develop, and exist while facing a permanent threat from the territory of today's Ukraine. I think you'll find Putin's own words to be the best description of motivation. It's not just Putin. Russia has a political class. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. They say Putin, Putin, Putin. There's actually some people around Putin that are even more hardline than he is. Putin isn't interested in making Ukraine part of Russia. He's interested in making sure it did not become, quote his words again, a springboard for Western aggression against Russia. They say Putin is lying about his motives because the U.S. only acts defensively. And you can see how you can go around in circles. The world isn't allowed to see the U.S. aggression, like the cocaine coups in Latin America. And
I guess to resolve the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, both parties have outlined specific conditions that need to be met. Russia's demands primarily focus on limiting Ukraine's military capabilities and connections with Western alliances. Specifically, Russia wants Ukraine to remain neutral without formal ties to military alliances like NATO, and has proposed limitations to Ukraine's military size and armament capabilities. These conditions aim to curb Ukrainian nationalism and reduce the influence of Western military support, particularly from the United States. On the other hand, Patrick, Ukraine, supported by Western allies, seeks a resolution that ensures its sovereignty and security. Ukrainian leaders emphasize the importance of concrete, mutually agreeable terms that include security guarantees from the West to prevent any future aggression from Russia. Such guarantees could potentially include direct military support and strategic alliances akin to NATO membership, which would offer a more robust deterrence against future conflicts. The situation remains complex, with ongoing discussions and negotiations needed to reach a peaceful and sustainable resolution. Both sides have expressed the necessity of external guarantees to ensure compliance with any agreed terms, highlighting the role of international diplomacy in securing peace in the region. So please tell us what Russia wants for them to win the war, and what does Ukraine want?
okay, well, in the case of Russia, they've outlined three conditions, and they've been very consistent from right from the beginning. They want Ukraine to acknowledge the new territorial realities, which means that these disputed provinces are now part of Russia, Crimea, Donbass, and a couple other ones. Secondly, they want Ukraine to be militarily neutral and never join NATO. And third, and I think this is the hardest for people in the West to understand because we haven't been allowed to see how things have really developed since the 2013-2014 coup in Ukraine, but Russia wants denazification of Ukrainian society. Now, what does Ukraine want? That's a little harder to tell because they keep changing. And what does
they start with one thing and then they change their goals.
What does the Ukrainian victory even look like at this point? On the one hand, Zelensky says, we will never surrender. He talks of a 100-year war. But he admits that the disputed provinces may be lost forever to Ukraine. He wants a freezing of the war that would entail a loss of these lands. It seems like he's trying to save face. And actually, it only makes sense, Zelensky's position makes sense because he's said in all the interviews that he thinks Russia wants to conquer all of Ukraine. It's hard to know if he really believes this. He seems drunk on all the media attention. He's an actor with very powerful forces behind him. If you listen to Putin, what he wants is a militarily neutral Ukraine, as well as the denazification of the society. And the whole operating theory of Ukrainian nationalism is straight up neo-Nazi. And eventually their country will be so crushed in every way that it could become a failed state crumbling from within, like the Congo or Venezuela. For the West, Ukraine is like the herd of pigs where Christ sent every evil demon. Ukraine is a recipient of this horror show. And for what? To be part of NATO? Now, in your introduction, Kholy, you talked a lot about like Ukrainian sovereignty and what the Ukrainian people want. But Ukraine, since 2014, is not what we would call a democracy. And this is one of the reasons why when Putin talks of denazification, it just sounds paranoid. Nazis, what? But they've been putting the political parties in jail, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
So why do they need NATO now that the Cold War has ended?
Yeah, this is NATO is a relic of the Cold War, and one of the things that really has Putin worried is Article 5 of NATO treaties, which states that if a NATO country is attacked, then all the NATO countries are required to come to its defense. And so he said that he had to intervene in Ukraine's civil war when he did, because if he had intervened in Ukraine's civil war, once Ukraine was part of NATO, then it would have evolved into a world war. But yeah, a lot of peace activists have asked the same question, why do we still need NATO now that the Cold War has ended? And at one point, Putin actually wanted Russia to join NATO, and there was talk about, at the end of the Cold War, there was talk about Russia signing peace treaties with the United States, but the United States didn't want anything of it. This war, though, didn't start 3 years ago. This war started in 2014 with a coup in Ukraine, and it's without looking at the events of the coup. It's called the maiden coup. We're not going to have a context for understanding about Russia's special military operation. And that's one of the things that for me is so maddening about all the press coverage, is they talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine like it was just random, nothing provoked it. I remember watching the news coverage in the week before Russia's invasion, and it was almost like Zelensky was trying to get Russia to invade. There was two things that happened that were really significant. One, Ukraine actually launched a missile into the downtown shopping area of the major city in the Donbass province. And then Zelensky started talking about Ukraine getting nuclear weapons for a future war with Russia.
And so it's, and we forget that the provinces that were embroiled in the civil war, they actually asked for Russia's intervention because 60% of their fighting force had all died. So this war didn't start a few years ago. It started with the coup, and the coup was fomented by the United States, and they're very good at doing this. They've been perfecting the technique of these color revolutions for years, and they go in with billions of dollars and set up new TV stations, new radio stations, new newspapers. They work with spammers, hackers, influencers, bloggers. They're very effective at it. The United States prefers to change governments that way rather than sending in the military. And over the years, they've been very adept at it. Look, they did it in 1953 in Iran with only $1 million, and now they do it to a tune of billions of dollars. And I mean, with that kind of funding, we could create a revolution here in Machala.
Yeah. That seems strange to me that there are North Korean troops now inside of Russia.
Yeah, there's 10,000 of them. And they've gone to this province inside of Russia, which Ukraine has taken. It shows how desperate Putin has become. I don't think he likes North Korea. He's an opportunist. Nobody likes the government of North Korea. On the other hand, Russia may be doing the North Koreans a favor. It will be their first exposure to reality and to freedom. They're not allowed to travel, drink vodka, laugh. Let's not forget, this is a proxy war by the US. Russia has updated their first strike nuclear doctrine, and the outgoing lame duck Biden administration, as you mentioned, he finally gave permission to use long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia. And Russia made it clear that they consider this an attack by NATO on Russia, and therefore nuclear weapons are on the table. It's unclear what Donald Trump's position actually is. All the foreign policy elite want war. As long as Ukraine has martial law, all elections are banned, political parties are banned. Politics were banned since 2014, and that's why these provinces declared their independence. At first, they didn't even want to be part of Russia. They declared themselves to be a republic. And what's our working theory about political violence? When you deny the political option, that's when political violence broke out. The Ukrainian army has a recruitment problem, and they're now going to rock concerts to grab men. 50,000 men are now in line for plastic limbs, prosthetic arms. But I'll give you an example of just how bad it is in Ukraine, and it's been since 2014. They've been putting Russian literature professors in jail. They recently raided the house of a politician and arrested his wife because it was found that she had dual Russian-Ukrainian nationality and she had a Russian passport. People have even been arrested for writing in Russian on Facebook. So this is called ethnic cleansing, and Zelensky always gaslights this. He pretends that it's not happening, and unless you had access to Russian media, you wouldn't be aware of this. And the Maidan coup started because of massive protests, because the president of Ukraine, who was pragmatic about relationship with Russia, he pulled Ukraine out of a trade agreement. It was a trade agreement with the European Union that was so bad, it would have bankrupted their economy, because they would have had to spend billions of dollars to retrofit their factories to European standards. But when he pulled Ukraine out of this trade agreement, it was broadly seen as cozying up to Russia. And so then these protests started, and the United States got involved. Look, you have to try and see things from Russia's perspective. Imagine Mexico had a president and China financed protests that saw the president and entire government in Mexico replaced. And overnight, China spent billions of dollars on new TV stations, new newspapers, all blaring an anti-United States message. Then when you couldn't imagine anything getting worse, some provinces in Mexico said they don't want to be part of the new Chinese-inspired Mexican government, and they formed their own republic. For 8 years, China wages a war against these holdouts by supplying the new coup leaders with heavy weapons and machinery. For 8 years, the US does nothing, but finally intervenes. That's what it's like for Russia. They don't want an anti-Russian Ukraine beachhead armed to the teeth with US military bases and missiles aimed at Moscow. Ukraine and Russia were brothers. They had close relations. They speak the same language. And all that changed in 2013, 2014 because of Obama. And the way these color revolutions work is through the State Department, it's through the embassies. They use hackers, spammers, trolls, influencers. And the United States is very good at using information warfare to cause regime change. And this way the US achieves its foreign policy goals without sending in the Marines. And they feed off the destabilization. The US has a long history of this. And the US, by the way, has a long history also of intervening in civil wars, like the civil wars they've started, like in Serbia in 1998. Putin is more well-versed on statecraft, history, and geopolitics than any American president. And he's now started the BRICS economic alliance, which threatens the US dollar as the world reserve currency. You know, what we're seeing now is the end to the unipolar world that dominated geopolitics since 1989. 2 weeks ago, Russia's foreign minister reiterated what it would take for them to stop the war in Ukraine. Ukraine needs to acknowledge the territorial realities, the new territorial realities, their losses. They need to be militarily neutral. This means not joining the NATO alliance. And they need to grant rights to Russians living in Ukraine and Russian speakers living in Ukraine. When Putin talks, he often mentions this denazification, which could also be seen as this third criteria. In other words, they want certain things to go back to the way they were pre-coup. This third criteria, though, rights for Russians, is going to be the hardest for a Trump administration to negotiate because in all the Western press, the world press, there's been no acknowledgement of these fundamental rights being stripped. As long as the Donbass regions these border provinces were able to vote, they always voted for pro-Russian or pragmatic Ukrainian politicians. But now all the political parties have been banned. They don't have elections and politicians are in jail. We call this ethnic cleansing anywhere else. And Zelensky has said they're not going to have elections because there's martial law. It's easy to go on. One reason these three provinces decided to join the Russian Federation is because a death sentence hung over them. They lived in mortal fear of Russia leaving and Ukrainians coming and dragging them from their home. Remember that according to Ukraine, these people that live in the border provinces are traitors and they could be killed under Ukrainian law. And now, since the announcement by the Russian foreign minister of these three conditions, Donald Trump has won the presidency in the US, and he had a conference call with Vladimir Zelensky, as well as his vice president, J.D. Vance, and Elon Musk. And we know what they proposed. They proposed on freezing the conflict, saying that Ukraine could join NATO in 20 years, and they proposed a demilitarized zone, similar to what's in Korea. But it's unlikely that this would be acceptable to Russia. It's a way, I think, for Zelensky to save face. And Zelensky always says that he's fighting to keep Russia from taking all their land piece by piece. And he constantly says this, but there's no evidence that this is actually Russia's motive. We'll have to wait and see. Russia's goals now are likely different than what they started the war with. And the longer it goes, the position of Russia just strengthens. You know, and remember that Russia didn't start this war. It started in 2014 with the coup from Obama. At the time, you know, we just had the Arab Spring, the color revolutions were in the air. People thought, oh, the same thing is happening now in Ukraine that happened in Egypt and Syria and Tunisia. You probably remember the revolution in Egypt.
Yeah, in 2011.
Yeah, and so it would just follow the pattern of these color revolutions. Of course, didn't work out too well for Syria either. They become a basket case in civil war. But it was presented in the media as, oh, the people are rising up to kick out a corrupt oligarch. The corrupt oligarch, though, in quotes, was the president the people had voted in. And that's why I say there was a coup. There was an assassination attempt on his life. At the same time, the protesters were burning alive groups that wanted to hold rallies for peace. And this caused the provinces along the border with Russia to form their own federation. And then later they voted to be part of Russia. And Russia stepped in to stop the civil war. So the idea that nothing provoked Russia is, I don't agree with that. And like I said, two significant things happened that prompted Russia to intervene. From my perspective, the Ukrainians launching a missile into the downtown of the province of the Donbass, and Zelensky talking about getting nuclear weapons. So it's not like Russia acted randomly. In fact, there were peace agreements like the Minsk Accords that had been set out for trying to end the civil war, but Ukraine didn't abide by them.
But doesn't the US have a duty to support Ukraine so Russia doesn't finish them off?
Well, that's what Zelensky says. He says that Russia wants to take all of their land piece by piece. This is the problem with peace talks that are talking at cross purposes, because you don't actually acknowledge what the other side is saying. And what's the goal, though, by the US supporting Ukraine? Complete devastation? Look, Ukraine cannot win. They're bankrupt now. An entire generation of men have been wiped out. And for what? Zelensky's ego and now saving face? If he were a politician instead of an actor, he might be more pragmatic.
Russian soldiers were marching on Kiev and were beaten back.
Yeah, and Zelensky says this. The Russians say they pulled back because they thought Ukraine was going to negotiate a peace deal, you know, the one at Constantinople where Boris Johnson encouraged them to get out. But personally, I think it was some of both. I think Putin was shocked by the losses on the Russian side. So they also say they wanted to take the heat off the Donbass region, which had been in the civil war, you know. And again, as long as the Donbass and the Crimea were able to vote, they always had a pro-Russian majority in the Ukrainian National Assembly. And a year into the war in 2023, these border provinces voted to join Russia, but Ukraine still considers them part of Ukraine, but now there's an admission that they're gone. So it's hard to see exactly what Ukraine thinks they're fighting for. And the neo-Nazi groups, these extreme anti-Russian groups that believe that Ukraine is a separate ethnicity from Russia and separate language and all that, they'd always been a minority in Ukraine. They could never get voted in.
I've heard you mention neo-Nazis a couple times. How did World War II affect Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, and all this should be history because the Soviet Union is no more. But basically, in the Second World War, it was the Soviet Union, communism against Nazism. And so there are now those that in Ukraine that want to glorify the Ukrainians that joined with Hitler because from their perspective, they were fighting for independence against Russia. And of course, one of the dirty secrets of World War II is that the United States and England were aligned with the Soviet Union. And in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union was just as bad as the Nazis. But now Ukraine is seeing their part in World War II in isolation. And in Canada recently at the Canadian Parliament, or I guess it was last year, but they actually honored a Nazi. And this is very shocking for Russia because, you know, they lost more people in World War II than anyone else. But the extreme Ukrainian nationalists, they're they started making heroes of Nazis, and that's something that really scares Russia.
Yeah, here the main question that could come to everybody's mind, like, what can Trump do?
Yeah, well, with Trump, it's a lot of rhetoric. During the campaign, he said that he would have the war stop even before he was president, just as soon as he won the president, because he would get Zelensky and Putin on the phone. But I don't know. I don't know. He's talking about freezing the conflict, but I don't think he really understands what the problem is.
They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Thanks, Patrick, for these insights. In a lot of ways, you're right that we are now in a multipolar world. What that will mean is hard to say. A question for our audience is, would you sleep better at night knowing that the US isn't the only superpower? That's all for today. Remember, stay informed, keep thinking, and question more.